They told me the school had been abandoned for decades, just another forgotten project on the edge of town. But the first time I stepped inside, I heard whispers moving through the pipes, like voices waiting for me. Some classrooms looked untouched, yet every desk was perfectly arranged, as if the lesson had already begun. I came there to fix the heat, but something in that building was already awake. Greetings, every shadow hides a story. Welcome. Under the bed. It happened in a small town on the edge of the Cherkasy region in central Ukraine, in late October of last year. My name is Mark. I was 30 then, and I took a short contract as a heating technician because rent was due and the calls had gone quiet. The job was simple on paper: check the old radiators and boiler lines in a school the council wanted to finally open after decades of delay. It was a cold morning, wet fog pressed against the windshield, and the building stood at the end of a birch-lined street, for stories of pale brick that never warmed to the sun. They told me the school was built in the late 90s and then abandoned when funding dried up. Water had been shut off, power cut, and the keys passed between caretakers who never stayed long. I met the current one in the yard, a thin man in a gray jacket that hung loose from his shoulders. He introduced himself as Petro and kept his hands in his pockets like the air hurt his fingers. He did not unlock the main doors until I signed a paper on a clipboard, a simple acknowledgement that I was inside by my own responsibility. The hallways smelled like wet plaster and old books. My boots clicked on tiles that were clean in a way that did not look fresh, only unused. A bulletin board held yellowed sheets announcing a first day that never came. The silence felt too heavy for an empty building. Petro led me to a switch room near the entrance, showed me which breakers to leave alone, and then handed me a ring of keys that looked like a chain from a bicycle. He did not offer to help. Work always steadies my nerves. I followed the schematic pasted to a wall, traced the risers and returns with a pen, and listened for air in the lines. The radiators were the old cast iron kind that looked like ribs, still cold to the touch. I kept moving, floor by floor, classroom by classroom, opening valves that had not turned in years. There were chalkboards without chalk dust, desks without scratches, and windows that faced the yard where no footprints marked the frost. At noon the light thinned to a color that made everything inside feel farther away. I asked Petro for the basement access. The main loop would run through the heat exchanger and pumps below. He pointed to a metal door at the back of the corridor and said, for the first time since I arrived, a sentence longer than 2 words. The steps are steep. Take your phone light. The basement air was close and sour, the kind that sticks to your palate. The concrete steps creaked under a skin of moisture. My lamp cut a comb through the dark and found a corridor with whitewashed walls and a line of rusty conduits overhead. The main pipe ran left, toward a room marked with a flaking stencil, thermal unit. The door groaned when I pushed it. Inside, the pump housing sat like empty chests and the manifold was capped with dull brass. I knelt to check the gaskets and only then saw the wall to my right. It wasn't concrete. It was a patchwork. At first my brain made it a pattern, gray on gray, until the shapes became letters. Stone slabs, set on their sides, mortar pressed between them. The chisel marks were shallow but deliberate. I wiped dust away with the cuff of my sleeve and read 3 lines cut into the face of one block, a name, a year, and a short plea. The year was 1952. The edges of the letters were stained darker than the stone, like water had found them again and again. I told myself it was salvage. Builders do that when budgets are thin. But I kept reading. There were more. Some slabs had an iron cross etched into them. One had a pair of dates too close together to be a full life. I took a step back and my boot scuffed the floor where someone had drawn a line in chalk, a rectangle that boxed in the manifold. In the upper corner, a child's handwriting had pressed through dust. They never left. I stood too fast and the blood rushed from my head. The building settled above me with a noise like a long breath. Pipes clicked in sequence. I told myself it was contraction in the cold. I moved to the service hatch to check the feeder valves and heard it for the first time, a small sound in the metal, a thin thread of voice. It ran along the pipe, not from one place but through it, like air paired with sound. Words were hard to catch, Not language at first, only cadence. Then I recognized the rhythm. It was slow, repeating, the way older people recite prayers by heart. I killed my lamp to prove to myself I was not imagining it. The dark pressed in. The voice became clearer when I closed my eyes, as if sight only got in the way. Not one voice. Several. A whispering that came together and fell apart, sometimes overlapping as if catching up. It rose when I touched the pipe and hushed the second I pulled my hand away. I turned the lamp back on, careful now, and traced the line to a vertical section that climbed toward the ground floor. At the base someone had hung a string of keys on a nail, long corroded into a single brown shape. Above it, in thin pencil, barely visible, a few words in Ukrainian, "Don't open." We already did. When I came up, Petro was waiting at the end of the corridor with his hands still in his pockets. His face looked older in the fluorescent light. I started to say what I had seen, but he shook his head once, small and quick, like a warning a dog would understand. "You get paid for pipes," he said. "Not for walls." He turned and walked away before I could answer. I stayed for one more hour, long enough to list the parts one needed and lock the basement behind me. The daylight had gone thin and sour. In the yard the birches flicked their white bark in the wind like something trying to get free of its skin. I made a note on my clipboard, "Return with couplers, valve grease, thread tape." The words looked normal. My hand did not. That night, in my apartment, the radiator in the bedroom ticked the way old radiators do when a system wakes up after a long sleep. It should have comforted me. The noise was familiar, friendly almost. But then the rhythm settled into that same low cadence I had heard in the basement, and I realized it was not random at all. It was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause, whisper, begin again. I lay awake until the city quieted and the pipes cooled. In the morning I would go back. The contract was 2 weeks. I could not afford to walk away. I told myself it would be fine in daylight, that names in stone were only names, that chalk rubs off with the palm of a hand. I told myself many things. None of them helped. I went back to the school the next morning. The fog had thickened overnight, and the road into town looked washed out, like it led nowhere. Petro wasn't outside this time. The gates were open, but the yard was empty. The building waited, pale and still, its windows reflecting only the dull gray of the sky. Inside, the air was heavier than before. I told myself it was just the damp settling, but it felt more like the air had weight, the kind that presses against you when something doesn't want you there. My boots echoed across the tiled floor as I made my way toward the basement door. Every sound I made came back slower, softer, like the school was swallowing it. I had brought the parts one needed, couplers, tape, a wrench set. Simple tools for simple work. The kind of job that shouldn't involve anything strange. But the moment I reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized something had changed. The chalk rectangle I'd seen yesterday was gone. The floor had been wiped clean, yet faint smudges remained in the shape of small, uneven circles. They looked like prints left by small shoes in dust. I turned on my light and walked deeper. The whispering in the pipes didn't start immediately this time. For a while, all I could hear was my breathing and the slow drip of water from somewhere unseen. When the sound did return, it came from farther down the corridor, soft, rhythmic, like someone humming through metal. That was when I noticed the second door. It was half hidden behind a sheet of plywood leaning against the wall. A metal sign above it, nearly rusted flat, read, "Archives." I tried the handle, it didn't move. The frame was sealed with thick nails driven across it. I hesitated, then looked back at the stairs. No one was there. Curiosity beat out common sense. I used the claw of my hammer to pry one of the nails loose. They came out too easily for how old they looked. Behind the door, the smell hit first, stale paper, mold, and something faintly metallic, like dried blood. I coughed and switched my light to a wider beam. Inside were stacks of boxes collapsed into themselves, and on the far wall, a shelf sagging under the weight of folders. I brushed dust from the nearest one. The label read Municipal Cemetery Relocation Project, 1997. I froze. The words felt unreal in the silence. I opened the folder, slowly. Inside were typed forms and handwritten notes. Each page listed names, hundreds of them, alongside a column marked transferred. Half were ticked off in blue pen. The rest were blank. I followed the paperwork trail deeper into the room. There were maps pinned to corkboard, yellow and curling at the edges. One showed the old cemetery's layout. Another showed the proposed site for the new school, drawn directly over it. Someone had circled half the plots in red. Underneath, in pencil, a note, Phase 2 never completed. A drop of water hit the map. I looked up. The ceiling above was lined with pipes, one of them split along its seam, leaking slow rust-colored drips. The water trailed down my arm as I reached to touch it, warm, somehow, like the temperature of skin. It smeared across the map, and for a moment, I thought the paper itself was bleeding. When I wiped it with my sleeve, I saw the faint outline of a small handprint, darker than the rest of the page. I stood there, frozen, while the drip stopped entirely. Something moved in the hall behind me. I turned my light toward the doorway. A shape crossed just outside, quick, light, the height of a child. I stepped forward and called out, "Petro?" No answer. I checked the hall. Empty. Only the hum of the pipes, steady and low. I returned to the archive room, grabbed a few of the papers, and stuffed them into my bag. Whatever this was, it wasn't just neglect or superstition. The town had built a school on top of a graveyard, and never finished moving the dead. When I went back upstairs, Petro was waiting by the door again. His expression didn't change when he saw the dust on my hands. "You went downstairs again," he said quietly. "I found records. About the cemetery." He looked at me for a long time, then said, "You shouldn't read old names. They remember being read." Before I could answer, he walked away, down the corridor, his footsteps fading into the echo of the empty building. That night, I spread the papers on my kitchen table. The writing was smudged, but one list stood out, children's section, written in blue pen. Dates from the 1950s, some even earlier. All marked not transferred. Around midnight, the documents began to curl at the edges from the heat of the radiator. I leaned closer and realized the pipes were warm again, though the system at the school had been shut off for years. The hiss of steam rose from the metal, soft at first, then growing into that same whispering chant I'd heard in the basement, voices overlapping, calm, patient, waiting. The next morning, when I checked my phone, I saw a new photo in my gallery. It was taken from the basement corridor. My flashlight beam stretched toward the end of the hall, and just before the frame cut off, a figure stood there, small, barefoot, facing the wall. I hadn't taken that picture. By the third day, I had convinced myself that everything strange I'd seen could be explained. Old buildings hold sounds, water leaves marks, memories twist when you work alone too long. That's what I told myself on the drive back. The fog had lifted, but the air still carried the same metallic taste. When I unlocked the main door, Petro wasn't there. His jacket hung on a hook, his keys gone. The hallway was colder, though the morning sun streamed through the tall windows. Dust floated like thin smoke. Somewhere above, a door creaked open and then closed again. I thought it was the draft until I realized there was no wind. I started with the second floor, where the main heating loop split between classrooms. The pipes moaned faintly, the kind of vibration that travels through walls. I followed the sound to room 2B. The door was half open. I pushed it wider and froze. Every desk was turned toward the blackboard, neat rows that hadn't been like that yesterday. I'd moved them myself to get to the radiator. The board was clean except for one faint line written in chalk, "We're still here." It looked too fresh to be old. The handwriting was uneven, like that of a small child. I rubbed it away with my sleeve, then checked my phone camera to be sure I wasn't imagining it. Nothing unusual. Just the empty room, pale light, dust. Still, my hands were shaking. I opened the radiator valves and let out the air. The hiss that escaped didn't sound like gas, it sounded like a sigh. A voice whispered something that could have been my name, but the pipes were old, and metal echoes are strange things. I finished quickly and left the room without looking back. The next classroom was the same, desks aligned, a faint mark on the board, this time a drawing of a small bell. I wiped it off before thinking and moved on. Each room felt heavier than the last. The air didn't move, it pressed close, thick and damp. By afternoon I had only one corridor left to check. A door at the far end caught my attention. It wasn't on the floor plan. Its paint was newer, the handle shiny. I tried the knob, unlocked. Inside, the space was smaller than a classroom, almost like a storage area. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes, books, and old teaching supplies. In the corner, a half-open locker held a cardboard box filled with small toys, wooden blocks, a skipping rope, a set of alphabet cards yellowed with age. On top of the pile was a photograph curled at the edges. It showed a group of children standing in front of a different school building, older, wooden. The note on the back read, "Class of 53, all gone." I turned the photo over again and noticed one detail I'd missed. Behind the children, on the hill, stood a structure with the same windows as this school. Except in the picture, the walls looked unfinished, raw concrete, as if both buildings had existed at the same time. A sudden clang echoed through the hallway, the sharp ring of a bell. The sound rolled through the air, bouncing off walls, fading slowly. My phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen showed the time, 3:15. The school had no power, there was no working bell system. I walked back toward the stairs, heart racing. The sound had come from above. On the third floor, every door was open. I stepped inside one of the rooms and saw faint footprints in the dust, small and leading between desks. I followed them until they stopped at the window. The glass was cold under my hand, yet on the outside, there was no mark, as if whoever made them had never left the room. I went downstairs, grabbed my tools, and locked the main door behind me. In the yard, the birch trees were still, not a breath of wind. The silence of that place followed me home. That night, I checked my phone again. The photograph I'd taken earlier of the empty classroom was no longer empty. Near the back row, a faint outline had appeared, a small figure sitting at a desk, head bent, hands folded as if waiting for something. I zoomed in, but the image blurred until it dissolved into gray noise. A message popped up on the screen. No sender, no number, just a single line of text, "Bell rings tomorrow." I didn't sleep. Every creak in the pipes sounded like a step in the hallway. Every flicker of the heater light reminded me of the hum of that building. I told myself not to go back, that no contract was worth this. But when morning came, the message was gone, and a new one replaced it, this time in my email, from the city office. Inspection scheduled. You are required on site. I packed my bag again. The road to the school was empty, the air dry and brittle. I kept telling myself I would finish the job and leave before nightfall. But somewhere deep down, I already knew that place wasn't finished with me yet. The fourth morning began with rain, a steady, whispering drizzle that blurred the road into a sheet of silver. The school loomed out of it like something half-buried, the brickwork darker and slick. I parked near the side gate, engine still running, and sat for a minute, watching the windows. Some of them reflected the pale sky, others were completely black, like holes. When I finally stepped inside, the air felt colder than outside. My breath hung in front of me. The halls were darker than they should have been. Even though it was mid-morning, every fluorescent bulb flickered, their light pulsing unevenly. Somewhere in the building, metal clanged softly, like a door shifting on its hinges. I called for Petro, but the echo was my only answer. His jacket was gone from the hook. I started toward the basement door, trying not to think about the silence pressing around me. The smell of dust and wet concrete grew stronger with every step. When I reached the door, the padlock that had hung there the previous day was missing. The stairs were slick with condensation. My flashlight caught the glimmer of water pooling at the bottom. The hum from the pipes was gone. only the faint drip of water echoed through the concrete corridor. I turned left, toward the main heat chamber, but halfway down, the beam of my light caught something new, a glint of metal at the end of the hall. It was a nameplate, bolted to the wall. I wiped the grime away and froze. The engraving read M. Kovalenko, Maintenance, 2025. My name. The same year. The letters looked old, corroded, as if they'd been there for decades. For a long moment I just stood there, staring, waiting for some explanation to form. It didn't. My breathing turned shallow. The silence around me seemed to move, tightening, vibrating faintly. I backed away, heart pounding, until my shoulder brushed a pipe. That's when I heard it again, the whispering, but clearer this time. The words layered over each other, dozens of voices blending into one low chant. The language wasn't clear. Some words were Ukrainian, others not at all. My flashlight flickered once, twice, and went dark. I struck it against my palm until it came back to life, the beam shaky. It landed on something in front of me, the outline of wooden boxes built into the concrete floor. I crouched down. They weren't boxes. They were coffins, small, half-filled with hardened cement. The cement was cracked in places, and inside, something glimmered, bits of fabric, fragments of glass, a small shoe still holding its shape. A child's shoe. I dropped my light for a second, hands trembling. A sound came from the far end of the corridor, soft footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I turned the light that way and saw movement, the outline of someone just beyond the curve of the hall. Petro? My voice didn't sound like mine. The shape stopped. Then a whisper answered, not from the figure, but from the walls. Teacher's here. A second later, all the classroom doors above began to slam in sequence, one after another, the sound rolling through the building like thunder. Then came a faint ringing, the bell. It shouldn't have been possible. There was no power, no electricity connected to the main circuit. Yet the ringing grew louder, echoing through the pipes. I ran toward the stairs, flashlight beam shaking wildly across the walls. Shadows moved ahead of me, stretching long and thin, like people walking where no people were. The closer I got to the stairs, the heavier the air became, dense, as if the building was holding its breath. At the landing, I turned once more toward the corridor. The light caught a reflection in the water on the floor. I looked closer. It wasn't just water. The puddle mirrored a ceiling that wasn't there, rows of desks, children sitting at them, motionless. For a second, I thought I heard their voices. Then the reflection rippled and broke apart. I pushed through the basement door and stumbled into the main hallway. The bell stopped abruptly. Silence followed, thick and complete. I leaned against the wall, gasping. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen lit up with a new photo. My own face, pale, half-lit by the flashlight. Behind me, barely visible, a figure stood among the coffins, a tall man with his head bowed. I dropped the phone and backed toward the exit. The automatic lights near the door flickered on for the first time since I'd arrived. For a heartbeat, I saw the hallway clearly, and the small, wet footprints leading from the basement up to the classrooms. I ran outside into the rain. The cold air hit like a slap. I looked back at the building. Every window on the top floor glowed faintly orange, as if lit from within. Then, one by one, they went dark again. That night, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Exhaustion, stress, the dim light, the isolation, all the excuses I could think of. But deep down I knew none of them fit. I had seen that nameplate. I had heard those voices. And whatever waited in that basement had started moving again after years of silence. The morning after the basement, I woke up on my couch with the television still on. The screen flickered between static and a frozen image of the school gates, a feed from the security camera I didn't remember opening. My phone was dead. My hands smelled faintly of rust and earth. I told myself I wouldn't go back. The contract didn't matter anymore. But by afternoon, my phone turned on by itself, showing a single notification from an unknown number, inspection delayed. Return keys. The message included a photo, the basement door, wide open. I sat there for a long time, the photo glowing in my hand, rain tapping softly on the window. Then I grabbed my jacket and drove back. The town was silent, as if holding its breath. When I reached the school, the yard was empty, the birch trees motionless. The building looked different now, cleaner somehow, its windows clear, the bricks lighter. It felt like something pretending to be harmless. The main doors opened easily. The air inside was warmer than it should have been. Every fluorescent light burned steady, humming softly. For the first time, the place didn't look abandoned. Desks stood in perfect rows. Chalkboards gleamed dark green. The faint scent of soap and paper filled the halls. I called for Petro, half hoping to hear him. No reply. From somewhere upstairs came the muffled sound of children's voices. Not laughter exactly, more like a low murmur, a classroom in session. I followed it up the stairs, each step slower than the last. On the second floor, the sound grew clearer, a rhythmic recitation, dozens of small voices speaking in unison. I reached room 2B, the one where I'd seen the words on the board. The door stood open. Inside, every desk was occupied. Children sat in neat rows, facing the front. Their faces were pale, faintly blurred, like the surface of water. They spoke softly, repeating words I couldn't understand. The teacher stood by the chalkboard, her back to me, hand moving slowly across the slate. My body refused to move. The teacher stopped writing, turned halfway, and I saw her face, not alive, not dead, just empty. The skin around her eyes was gray, her mouth a faint line. I recognized her from the old photo in the box, one of the adults standing behind the class of '53. She pointed toward me with a motion too slow, too heavy. The children's heads turned together, their voices fading into silence. One by one, they smiled. The lights flickered. The bell rang. It started as a dull, distant clang, then grew louder, vibrating through the floor and walls. Dust rained from the ceiling. The air shimmered with heat. I stumbled backward into the hallway, the sound following me like a heartbeat. Downstairs, the corridors were filled with light, orange, flickering like firelight, though there was no smoke. The pipes groaned. Somewhere deep below, something burst. Water, or something thicker, rushed through the system, spilling from radiators, creeping along the floor. I ran for the exit. But when I reached the main doors, they were sealed, fused to the frame like they'd never been meant to open. The lights above me dimmed, then flared. In their glow, I saw the reflection on the floor, rows of desks, an entire classroom arranged around me, though the hallway was empty. The bell rang again. I shouted, hit the door, kicked it until my hands and legs ached. Behind me, a voice spoke, a child's voice, clear this time. You fixed the heat. I turned. The figure from the reflection stood there, small, barefoot, clothes soaked dark. Its face was calm, expression almost grateful. We can start now, it whispered. Everything went white. When I opened my eyes, daylight filled the sky. I was lying on the grass outside the school gates, my jacket soaked, mud on my hands. A police car idled nearby. 2 officers stood over me, asking if I was all right. I couldn't answer. My throat felt raw. They told me they'd found me unconscious near the fence, my car door open, engine still running. Inside the building, they found nothing, no signs of fire, no water damage, no one inside. But they said the security lights had come on around midnight, in every room, for exactly 10 minutes. A week later, I went back once more, not inside, just to the gate. The building was sealed, a new chain on the doors. Through the windows I could see empty classrooms, dust floating in the shafts of light. On the wall above the entrance, workers had installed a new bronze plaque. Municipal School Number 7, in memory of the children of 1953. Underneath the dedication, smaller letters read, Maintenance by M. Kovalenko, 2025. I stood there until the wind picked up and the birches began to move again, their white bark whispering against each other. Then the bell rang once, faint, distant, from somewhere deep inside the building. And this time, it didn't stop.